Thank you. So I think our panel has a tough job to do compared to the previous panel, because we're supposed to actually be forward-looking and come up with tangible deliverables or solutions from the regional actors. As we heard in the previous panels, the threats, the lack of trust, the different, completely two different narratives, if not more, of what's actually happening in Syria. So how do you bridge the gaps to actually try to come up with some solutions? I'll try to run down some ideas, but also not to focus only on Saudi Arabia and Iran as regional actors. There's a reason that people say regional actors rather than just the Saudi-Iranian dynamic, which is important, of course, and cannot be undermined. But there are other regional actors who can at least help to bridge some of those gaps. I'll start by saying it's clear that everyone knows there has to be a political solution ultimately. But how do you ultimately get there? And the immediate goal has to be to stop the bloodshed and the killing. I don't think anyone can disagree on that point. Can you broker a political solution if militarily the sides that are fighting think that they can still an all-out victory? Why would you negotiate? And where we see ourselves at the moment with the Syrian regime having really significant advances, it's hard to see how they will come to negotiating position as they would have perhaps, say, a year ago. So it's something to keep in mind. I think we have to stop for a moment and look at what went wrong when we felt like we were getting close to a possibility of a political solution, which was the Geneva II talks. In principle, when you look at the mediator being somebody that's appointed from the UN and the Arab League, so you have the regional dynamic and the international dynamic, you had the governments and very prominent members of the government, and you had the opposition. For, I think, the most significant time, you actually saw a clear image of the political opposition coming together to speak, even if they can't represent everyone on the ground. They gave a good representation. However, the way that Geneva came together, or whether it was the invitation of Iran at the last minute and then the retracting of the invitation to Iran, the fact that actually the ministerial meeting in Montreux had really nothing to do with the negotiations, because it was a ministerial meeting, half a day of ministers coming, giving their speeches and leaving. And then leaving the two sides to negotiate with Ibrahimi. However, you had ambassadors not only from the regional countries or even the US and Europe that support the opposition deliberating with them daily. You had also Iranian and Russian diplomats deliberating daily with the government side. So it really wasn't just about the Syrians sitting together and talking. There was influences outside of the room. And we've seen how that failed. However, most people expected the first rounds of negotiations to fall apart because there's this huge trust deficit. The battles were ongoing on the ground. It almost was inevitable that they would fail. So what happens now that you've had the Geneva process? What can be learned from that failure, even though you're able to bring the two sides together? Daniel, you threw in the word of Ukraine, which of course changes the dynamic because you had the Americans and the Russians agree in principle that we have to come to a political solution. Can we still get that back? It's difficult to tell, so we'll have to see. I think it's very important to keep the Geneva II experience in mind and not just say it failed and that's all. There are lessons to be learned from that. I'll go into the next point, which is moving on from Geneva. There's no long-term vision of what Syria would look like. What does each country want realistically for Syria to look like? So of course, whatever way Syria comes out of this war, it's not going to be as it was now, and its alliances and what those alliances mean for the region and beyond has to be kept in mind, and that's still not clear. No one is actually honest in saying what their interests are from Syria. And while regional countries have an interest in Syria, I think it's also fair to say nobody has a right in Syria beyond the Syrians. There's constantly this say of, well, of course Iran has rights in Syria, or of course Saudi Arabia or other Arab countries have rights in Syria. Actually, it's the rights of the Syrians, and that's not just the polite thing to say or the nice thing to say. It's the reality, and the regional dynamic is taking on such a role in Syria, and we've seen it in Iraq also, we're seeing it in Lebanon, that actually undermines those states and continues to weaken them, that makes it impossible to see a political solution that can be lasting. Because I want to say that the model that we have in Iraq and in Lebanon, the political models, are both failed models. And we speak here today where we have a Lebanon without a president, without an actual sitting government, with a parliament that's very soon not able to function. So you have no real legitimacy going on there. We have in Iraq a very disputed political system and elections that have not really brought out a result that anyone can see a functioning government coming up soon. So we don't want this idea that a political solution is going to be based on different sectarian labels being put together and then enforced on the country. So perhaps another lesson learned is don't do Iraq and don't do Lebanon again. That shouldn't be the model that we're trying to learn from or try to repeat. We can learn from it for sure, but not to repeat. Another point I think that we really have to think about is, of the regional actors, who has leverage on the ground in Syria? Beyond the obvious, I mean, I'm not going to repeat the obvious points that, of course, the alliance between the Assad regime and Iran is very strong, that, of course, there are Arab countries, Turkey, Gulf countries who have links with opposition groups, and they publicly say it, and what support they give them. Beyond that, who has actually leverage on the ground? Because when there are certain deals that are being cut, whether it's related to Homs with fighters and the government, who's actually doing the negotiating or the mediating, let's say, who has that leverage that you can call to the table to talk about what regional actors can deliver? So that's one point, because I think leverage continues to change on the ground in Syria, especially from the opposition side, and you need to see who are the regional actors that actually can play a role. Now here, it's important to say that it can't just be regional, it has to be international. There's no way that we can cut off just the regional dynamic from the international. And we see that with the Core 11 group that now is the main supporters of the opposition, which is basically the 11 countries that have come out of the Friends of Syria meeting that meets regularly. And then on the other hand, you have, of course, Iran, Russia, and to a certain extent, China, on the other hand, supporting the regime. So the Core 11 group, their last meeting in London, the number one idea that came out from that is that those countries are more united than they have been in the past. Because even though these countries were all in one way or the other supporting opposition and against the regime in Syria, they were bickering amongst themselves. It seems at the moment they are closer, more aligned than they were previously. And that can help actually deliver more of a political solution, because at least they can give back the same messages to the different factions that are fighting on the ground to try to come to any political solution. I said that I talk about other regional actors that are not the obvious. So I'll start with Iraq. I think Iraq does have a significant role to play and is playing at the moment in Syria, whether it's the fighting that is ongoing through ISIS. You know, people think that it's the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria that is speaking about a shared future for Iraq and Syria, but really Iraq and Syria have a shared past and have a shared future. And so there's a way to bring Iraq on board. Of course, domestic politics, as was discussed earlier for Turkey, domestic politics in Iraq is playing a big role in actually how people perceive and look at Syria in terms of coming up with a solution. But we'll have to see how the next government comes. There won't be anything drastically different from what's the position at the moment, but you'll see different players within the Iraqi government, importantly the Kurdish parties, and the role that they can play in trying to bring about political solutions. The experience of those in power in Iraq today, many of them were in the opposition, and can see probably lines with Syrian opposition that most people don't recognize at first glance. So I think there's lessons to be learned there. And finally, you know, we must not forget that, of course, the same Iraqi government is the one that used to complain that Syria is supporting terrorism inside of Iraq in 2007, 2008, 2009. You had the Maliki government call on the UN to take procedures against the Assad government, saying that they are supporting terrorists inside of Iraq. So these alliances do change, and I think that's something to be kept in mind. I'll go into the next regional actor because I don't want to over-talk very briefly. Next regional actor, I think Jordan. Jordan, of course, most people look to the pressure that's under Jordan because, of course, the refugee influx and so forth. But Jordan has a lot of leverage. Like Iraq, there are alliances or relationships between tribes. There are shared tribes, shared families, and I think that can be brought into the table to discuss. And I believe that can help to understand Syria more. You can understand Syria more by looking to the Jordanians. So I'll quickly move on and say that trust will be key to deliver any political solution. So who are the actors that can actually start to build bridges between the different warring sides? That's still unclear. The region at the moment witnesses incredible doublespeak. You know, somebody says something, they mean something completely different. Someone talks about human rights and democracy, they absolutely don't mean human rights and democracy, they mean completely gagging the opposition. And so I think that one of the deliverables that can be done is that everybody in the region has to almost take a step back from the polarization and the poisonous kind of language that is surrounding the conflict as the bare minimum to try to come to a solution. Of course, we have important timeframes ahead of us. We have the 3rd of June, the elections. I think the political rhetoric is only going to get worse from both sides, but we have to see what happens after that. And immediately after political rhetoric, those that are opposed to the Syrian government will, of course, denounce the elections. Those inside Syria will say this means there's legitimacy. But what happens beyond that? So we'll have to wait and see what happens after that, although sadly that means more lives lost in the meantime. And I guess my very last point is 3 words: do no harm is the minimum that the regional actors can do.